The storm raged mercilessly, but nothing hurt more than the scene before him. The millionaire dropped everything and ran into the rain upon seeing his ex-wife and children being evicted, with nowhere to shelter. If you enjoy emotional dramas, subscribe to the channel and comment now from where you are listening. Continuing, Edward Henry Meadows had always believed the world revolved around him. At 45, he had built a real estate empire that stretched across the American Northeast. His name was whispered with reverence in the corridors of the National Business Council. His decisions moved millions, and his presence at any event guaranteed headlines in the business newspapers. For him, success was a simple equation: hard work, quick decisions, and a heart shielded from any kind of weakness. That Thursday night, returning from a victorious meeting in Washington, D.C., where he had closed a $200 million contract, Edward leaned back in the limousine's leather seat and smiled contentedly. The rain hammered on the car roof with an intensity only New York City knows in March, transforming the city into a blurred watercolor of neon lights and wet asphalt. His driver, Charles, navigated the downtown streets with the skill of someone who knew every pothole in the metropolis. It was when they crossed Liberty Street, on one of those turns life takes without warning, that Edward saw something that made his world stop. There, on the drenched sidewalk, a woman desperately tried to protect 3 children while furniture was thrown into the rain by 2 uniformed men. Her black umbrella slipped from her hands with each gust of wind, and the children clung to plastic bags full of clothes and toys. Edward blinked twice, thinking he was dreaming. But he wasn't. The woman there, soaked to the bone, was Helen Christine Santos Meadows, his ex-wife, and those 3 children crying and clinging to her were their children. Peter, 17, tried to save an electronic keyboard from the rain. Mary Ann, 15, held a stack of books against her chest, and John Michael, just 9, hugged a stuffed animal as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Edward's heart began to beat erratically. How was this possible? Helen worked. He knew that. He sent child support religiously every month. How could his children be evicted on a stormy night? Without thinking, Edward tapped on the glass partition separating the back seat from the driver's cabin. "Stop the car, Charles, now! Sir, you can't stop here. It's a priority lane for—" "I said stop the car." The limousine screeched to a halt with a sound of wet brakes. Edward jumped out into the rain, not caring about the $3,000 Italian suit he was wearing. He ran towards his family, feeling every cold drop of rain as a slap to his conscience. "Helen!" he shouted, taking off his jacket as he ran. "Helen, what's going on here?" Helen lifted her wet face, and for an instant, Edward saw the woman he had fallen in love with 20 years ago in law school. But it was just a ghost of that woman. Her face was thinner, marked by a weariness he didn't recognize. The brown eyes that once shone with love now stared at him with a mixture of surprise and something that cut him like a razor: contempt. "Edward," she whispered, incredulous. "What are you doing here?" He tried to cover her with his jacket, but Helen recoiled as if she'd been zapped. "Don't touch me," she said, with a coldness Edward had never heard. "You have no right." Peter, the oldest son, stopped trying to save the keyboard and glared at his father with a rage that burned hotter than the freezing rain. "Look who showed up," Peter said, his voice laden with sarcasm. The great businessman decided to emerge from his little glass world. Mary Ann said nothing, just turned her face away and continued protecting her books. John Michael hid behind his mother, holding his doll even tighter. "My God, Helen, explain what's happening," Edward insisted, trying to understand the surreal scene. "You're being evicted. How? I pay child support. I've always paid—" "Child support?" Helen gave a bitter laugh that was lost in the sound of the rain. "Do you think $1,500 a month supports 3 children in New York City? Edward, do you think that pays for private school, uniforms, books, medicine? What world do you live in?" Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. $1,500. That's what he spent on a business lunch. How had it come to that amount? Why had he never questioned if it was enough? "But you lived in a good apartment. I remember that." "I worked 3 shifts to pay for that apartment," Helen interrupted him, her voice choked with emotion. "In the morning at the law firm, in the afternoon giving private lessons, At night doing text revisions. 3 shifts. Edward, while you were closing multi-million-dollar contracts, I slept 4 hours a night to manage everything. The uniformed men continued removing the furniture. Edward looked at them and felt anger growing in his chest. "Stop that now," he shouted at the men. "Stop throwing those things in the rain." "Sir, we are complying with a court order," one of them replied, consulting a wet clipboard. "The property was repossessed for non-payment. Case number." Edward snatched the paper from the man's hands and read it quickly. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The company responsible for the repossession was Meadows and Associates. His own company had evicted his family. "This is a mistake," he murmured, rereading the document. "This has to be a mistake." "It's no mistake," Helen said, her voice tired. "It's what your company does, isn't it? Evicts poor people to build luxury high-rises. Congratulations, Edward. You managed to evict us too." Peter approached his father, his eyes blazing with anger. "You know what's funnier, Dad? We found out the whole building was going to be demolished to become another one of your rich people malls. Then we understood everything. You didn't disappear from our lives by chance. You disappeared because we weren't profitable enough." "Peter, it's not like that." "It's not like what, Dad? When was the last time you came to a school meeting? When was the last time you asked if I still play the piano? When was the last time you asked why Mary Ann cries every night studying for medical school entrance exams without money to pay the application fee?" Edward looked at Mary Ann, who continued protecting her books in the rain. She dreamed of going to medical school, always dreamed, and he didn't even know she was taking entrance exams. "And John Michael," Peter continued, relentless, "do you know he draws houses? He draws houses with the whole family gathered, because he doesn't even remember what it was like when we lived together. He's 9, Dad. 9 years old and doesn't remember you living with us." Edward felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He looked at John Michael, who observed him with large, curious eyes, as if he were seeing a stranger. "Let's go," Helen said, picking up one of the wet bags. "We don't have time for this." "Where are you going?" Edward asked, desperate. "To my sister's house in Newark, New Jersey. It's far, but at least she has a couch where the children can sleep." Edward looked around. His children, wet, homeless, carrying their whole lives in plastic bags. Helen, too proud to accept help, but too fragile to pretend everything was fine. And he, the great Edward Henry Meadows, completely helpless. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "I have an apartment in Greenwich Village that's empty. You can stay there." "We don't want your charity," Helen replied. "It's not charity. It's my responsibility. Please, Helen, look at the children. They're drenched. They're cold. At least for tonight." Helen looked at her children. Peter shook his head negatively, but Mary Ann coughed hard, and John Michael trembled violently. It was the mother's common sense speaking louder than the wounded woman's pride. "Just for tonight," she whispered. "Just until the rain stops." But Edward knew, deep in his heart, that rain had washed away much more than the streets of New York City. It had washed away the illusion that he could live forever, pretending his family didn't exist. And now, soaked to the bone on the sidewalk, he realized that all these years building an empire, he had lost his most precious kingdom. The storm outside was just beginning. The storm within him had already lasted 5 years. And finally, he was ready to face it. The apartment in Greenwich Village was the kind of place Edward bought for investment and forgot existed. 3 bedrooms, a view of the tree-lined street, furnished with that impersonal, magazine-spread decorating taste. When they arrived there, drenched and in silence, Edward realized how empty that place was. Beautiful, expensive, but completely soulless. Peter went straight to one of the bedrooms and closed the door. Mary Ann helped John Michael take a hot shower, while Helen stood in the living room, looking out the window as if she were on another planet. Edward didn't know what to do with his hands. For 5 years, he had led meetings, closed deals, made decisions that affected hundreds of people. But there, in that apartment, before his own family, he felt like a clumsy teenager. "There are dry clothes in the closet of the master bedroom," he said, breaking the silence. "And food in the fridge." Helen nodded without looking at him. "Edward," she said after a while, "thank you, but we're leaving tomorrow." "Why?" "Because we can't pretend we're a normal family. Because you have your life and we have ours. Because it hurt too much once and I won't let it hurt again." Edward swallowed hard. He wanted to ask about the divorce, about what had happened 5 years ago, about why Helen had asked for the separation out of nowhere. But the children were there, and some conversations had to wait. In the days that followed, Edward cancelled all his meetings and stayed in the apartment. On the first day, the tension was palpable. Peter barely spoke to him. Mary Ann was polite but distant, and John Michael observed him with curiosity, as if trying to remember who this man was. It was during breakfast on the third day that Edward noticed something that made him freeze. Helen's hand was shaking as she held her coffee cup. It wasn't just any tremor. It was the kind of tremor he knew because his grandmother had had rheumatoid arthritis. "Helen, are you all right?" "I'm just tired," she replied quickly, hiding her hands. But Edward had learned, in those days of forced cohabitation, to pay attention to details. Helen slept poorly, coughed a lot, and sometimes paused mid-action, as if she had forgotten what she was doing. It was Peter who told the truth. One afternoon, when Helen had gone out to retrieve documents from work. "She's sick," the boy said bluntly. "She has an autoimmune disease, lupus. The doctors said it's because of stress, excessive fatigue." Edward felt the world spin. "How long?" "About 2 years. She didn't want us to tell anyone. She was afraid of losing her job, of not being able to pay the bills. That's why she worked 3 shifts, even when sick. That's why she—" Peter stopped mid-sentence. But Edward understood. That's why she had lost so much weight. That's why she always looked exhausted. That's why she had lost the apartment. That night, Edward entered the company office with a single mission: to understand how his own company had evicted his family. What he found was worse than he imagined. Louis Frederick Carter, his partner and best friend since college, had personally authorized the repossession of the property. And not only that, there was a series of other predatory actions approved by him, always targeting vulnerable families. Edward stayed until 3 in the morning reviewing contracts, and what he discovered left him nauseated. His company, which he had always believed operated within legal bounds, was involved in a series of questionable practices: lightning-fast evictions, psychological pressure on the elderly, derisory offers for valuable properties. But it was in a locked drawer of Louis Frederick's desk that Edward found what changed everything: a folder with his name, full of photos, documents, and private investigator reports. Photos of Helen leaving a hospital. Photos of Helen talking to a man Edward immediately recognized: Mark, his brother. Among the papers, a handwritten note from Louis Frederick: "Plan worked." Edward believed the betrayal, divorce confirmed. Now just wait for him to completely distance himself from his family, to take full control of the company. Edward reread that note 10 times before fully understanding. Louis Frederick had orchestrated everything. The photos of Helen with Mark were real, but they didn't show what Edward had believed for 5 years. They showed Helen taking his brother-in-law to chemotherapy sessions. Mark had cancer at the time, a cancer he kept secret from the family out of pride. Helen was the only one who knew, the only one who accompanied him to treatments. Louis Frederick had hired a detective, manipulated the photos, created a false narrative, and presented everything to Edward at a time when he was vulnerable, exhausted from so many arguments over his work hours. Edward had believed without questioning, because it was easier to believe that Helen had betrayed him than to admit that he was neglecting his family. The divorce happened too quickly. Edward felt betrayed. Helen felt abandoned and misunderstood. Neither of them fought for the truth, and Louis Frederick took advantage of the separation to gradually assume more control of the company, always whispering in Edward's ear that he needed to move on and focus on business. The next morning, Edward confronted Louis Frederick in the office. The discussion was tense, full of accusations and denials, but when Edward presented the evidence, Louis Frederick finally admitted it. "You were too arrogant," Louis Frederick said, with a coldness Edward had never seen. "You were always everyone's darling, always had everything easy. I built this company as much as you did, but it was always Edward Meadows who got the credit. It was always you on the magazine covers. So you destroyed my family out of jealousy. I opened your eyes to what you really were, a man who loved work more than family. I just accelerated the inevitable." Edward left that office with one certainty. He would reverse every predatory action of the company, but first he needed to talk to Helen. He found her sitting on the apartment sofa, watching John Michael draw. She looked up when he entered, and Edward saw a sadness there that went beyond any physical pain. "I know about Mark," he said simply. Helen turned very pale. "I know about his cancer. I know about the chemotherapy sessions. I know you never betrayed me." Helen began to cry. It wasn't a loud, desperate cry. It was a cry of relief from someone who had carried an unjust pain for 5 years. "Why did you never tell me the truth?" Edward asked, sitting beside her. "Because you had already decided," she whispered. "You looked at those photos and decided I was guilty. You didn't even give me a chance to explain. How was I supposed to explain anything to a man who didn't trust me?" Edward closed his eyes. She was right. He had been judge and jury. He had condemned without allowing a defense. "And now?" he asked. "Now you know I never betrayed you. But that doesn't change the fact that you chose the company over us. That doesn't change the fact that you disappeared from your children's lives." Edward nodded. She was right again. "Can I try to change that?" Helen looked at him for a long time. "You can try, but you'll have to prove it. Not with money, not with expensive gifts. You'll have to prove that you truly want to be here." In the months that followed, Edward proved it. He completely restructured the company, removed Louis Frederick, and implemented social responsibility policies. He cancelled the demolition project for the building where Helen lived and transformed the edifice into subsidized affordable housing. More importantly, he proved it to his children. He attended all of Peter's piano recitals. He accompanied Mary Ann to all her interviews for medical school admissions. He taught John Michael to ride a bike in Central Park. Helen received treatment for lupus at the best hospital in New York City, but not as a favor from Edward, as her right, because Edward finally understood that caring for his family wasn't charity, it was an obligation. They didn't become husband and wife again. Some broken things don't fully mend, but they became true partners in raising their children. They became friends, and perhaps, who knows, one day they would become something more. At the end of the year, Peter played a song he composed for his father at a school concert. Mary Ann was accepted as the top applicant to Columbia University's medical school. John Michael drew a painting of the whole family reunited in the Greenwich Village apartment and gave it to his father on Father's Day. Edward framed that drawing and placed it on the office wall right behind his executive desk. Not to boast, but to remember. To remember that true success isn't measured in square footage built or contracts closed. It's measured in smiles regained, in hugs given at the right time, in being present when life happens. He learned that sometimes you have to be evicted from your own comfort zone to discover where you truly want to live. And he discovered that the place he wanted to live was quite simple, in the heart of his family. Edward still lives in the Greenwich Village apartment, alone in the rooms, but never truly alone. Because now he knows that every Thursday Peter comes for dinner and plays the piano. Every Friday Mary Ann stops by to study for her college exams. Every Saturday John Michael comes to draw at the kitchen table. And Helen lives in his heart, as she always has. The difference is that now he knows it, and more importantly, now he makes sure she knows it too. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Edward and Helen's story has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours. If you were moved by this journey of redemption and family rebuilding, please leave a like below and subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what moment stood out to you the most. Was it when Edward saw his family in the rain, when he discovered the truth about the divorce, or when he finally understood the true meaning of success? Every day we bring you intense stories like this, which reveal the deepest feelings of the human soul, the dilemmas we all face, and the strength that exists within each of us to start anew. Don't miss our next episode, because we have more exciting stories waiting for you. A big hug, and see you soon.